One of the hardest parts of sales enablement is explaining the value of the work in a way that leadership, sales, RevOps, finance, and other departments can all understand. You might run a strong program, sellers attend the sessions, managers say the session was useful, the assets post-session get shared, maybe even some of the numbers start moving later. But then comes the difficult question: what impact did enablement actually have? And that is where exactly a lot of teams tend to get stuck, rightly so, because it's not an easy feat. Some teams stay too close to activity, so they report things like completion, attendance, or asset usage. Other teams jump too quickly to revenue and try to claim impact on win rate, sales cycle, or deal size before they have enough evidence to make that claim credible. And this is a risky play because ultimately, if you're showing the impact without a clear chain of evidence and links between different parts of the execution, any claim made can really lose credibility very quickly in front of adept leadership teams. So I put together a guide and a one-pager on Enablement ROI, both linked in the description below. They cover the deeper model, the deeper approach to Enablement ROI, really distinguishing between, first and foremost, program ROI and function ROI. I also, in that guide, introduced the concept of return on expectations, ROE, which is something I came across for the first time when reading a book on the New World Kirkpatrick model, which I highly recommend, by the way. And then I also talk about the own-shape support model, a model that I will also come back to in a second as well. So the full guide goes much deeper with practical example as well that we can't cover here. In this video, instead, I wanted to focus less on explaining every part of the framework and more on how to apply it. At a high level, the idea is very simple. Enablement impact should be measured as a chain. What enablement delivered, what changed in execution, and how those changes supported business outcomes. So imagine you're an enablement leader, sales leader, or revenue team trying to make one strategic program more measurable. So the questions are, where do you start? What do you avoid? And what is the smallest useful version you can implement without building an AV measurement system? These are the kind of questions that we're going to explore in this specific video. So first, the best place to start is definitely not with full function level ROI. So functional ROI is still very important, but is usually broader, messier, and more political. It depends on portfolio level data, high cost visibility, consistent reporting, and also, most importantly, leadership agreement on what the enablement function as a whole is supported to improve over a certain period of time. So most teams, I would say, that are not ready to start there. But if you are, obviously, you can explore things further directly into the guide. So a better starting point is one bounded program, one business problem, and one outcome worth improving. So choose something close to live execution. For example, you might choose a program focused on reducing discounting in mid-market, or improving business case quality before proposal, or, shortening ramp for new account executives. The point is to avoid starting with, we're running training. Start with the performance problem first, always. For example, reps are reaching proposal stage without a quantified business case, and that is increasing discounting risk. So that gives the program a better reason to exist. From there, then you want to use 3 parts of the model I present. So first, you want to scope the ROI conversation. Are we talking about function ROI? Are we talking about program ROI? Or are we talking about tool ROI? Because that's also another element that often gets confused with the rest. That is a very important distinction to make. And in this case, obviously, we are, as we already highlighted, we're talking about program ROI. So if you're reviewing one value selling program, for example, you want to make that clear. You're not trying to prove the value of the whole enablement function. You're not reviewing the full tech stack. You're just looking at one program and the impact it was designed to create. Second, you want to create a simple ROE contract. This is a very powerful practice. So as we said, ROE means return on expectations, and in practical terms, it is an agreement that you make before launch on what success should look like, what behavior should change, what evidence will count, and who needs to reinforce the work. So this is where many teams skip this step, and this is a big mistake. So you build a program, you launch it, and then later you try to work out how it should be measured. That's definitely backwards, and that's not the best way to go. The expectations should be agreed before the work even begins. Third, you want to map own, shape, and support in reference to that model I was describing in the introduction. So what will enablement deliver? First question. Enablement owns outputs such as programs, tools, templates, certification, and manager guides. Then we have what execution change should appear in the field. Enablement shapes execution such as business case quality, discovery behavior, manager inspection, call quality, or pipeline hygiene. And finally, which business outcome should these changes support? So enablement supports outcomes such as win rate, sales cycle length, deal size, discounting rate, or quota attainment, for example. But it's important to say enablement supports those outcomes. It has to align to it, but it doesn't control them directly because they are shaped together with the other functions it's working with. Our work is cross-functional by nature. So if you get these three pieces right, then the ROI conversation becomes much easier later. Even if you never produce a formal ROI calculation, because we know it's difficult sometimes to isolate things, at least you'll be able to produce a credible contribution story. That's the most important thing. Now, the smallest useful version of what we are talking about here, in my opinion, is a one-page impact plan for one priority program. That's it. You don't need a perfect dashboard, you don't need a full ROI model, you don't need every system integrated, and you don't need RevOps to build a reporting engine before you can even start to talk more seriously about impact. The one-page plan should capture essentially the basics, right? So you name the program, you define the performance problem, you choose the business outcomes the program should support and describe it very clearly. You pick 2 execution shifts you want to inspect. So execution shift in the field, right? Things that should change in the field that are visible and observable. Then you want to list the enablement outputs you will deliver that are fully in our control. Then you decide which evidence source you will use. Where do you going to get the data in this case? And it's okay if initially things have to be a bit more manual, less automatic. It all depends on your maturity level. Then you want to set a simple review cadence. And if useful, and if you have the information, you can capture the broad cost categories you will track. So we can make this more concrete. Let's say, suppose the issue, as we said, is discounting in mid-market, right? So the business outcome might be reduced discount rate, a stronger average selling price, or fewer late-stage deals discounted above a certain threshold that has been defined. The execution shift might be stronger business cases and earlier economic buyer engagement, right? Then the enablement outputs might be a value selling workshop, a business case template that gets provided to the seller, a manager inspection guide, and a short certification exercise, something that really demonstrates that sellers are becoming more proficient at building business cases and talking value. So the evidence source might be a CRM field, deal review notes, a sample of stage 4 opportunity, or even manager inspection records if it's something that is done more manually. So the review cadence might be very simple. Every 2 weeks, inspect 10 live opportunities with the sales leadership and, let's say, managers, right? That may not be perfect, but it's still useful, and it creates a line of sight from the business problem to the execution change. That's the most important part, and it gives you enough evidence to build a contribution story or narrative, even if you are not ready yet to calculate ROI formally. So this is important because many teams, I think, tend to wait too long. They assume measurement has to be sophisticated before it is actually valuable. And I think if the earlier you start, the more adept you become over time to actually build those credible impact narratives. So I would say that a small evidence chain, reviewed consistently, is often more useful than a broad dashboard ultimately nobody trusts. And that is very factual, yes, but at the end of the day, we know that people buy into story, into narratives. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. Now, let's assume you're actually working in this process. I think it's also important to highlight what are some of the common implementation challenges you might come across that I feel like if you understand them early, you can actually avoid in some way or prevent from stopping to do some of the good work you can do. So the first challenge is obviously, very often happen, is unclear success criteria. So different stakeholders often define impact differently. Sales may care about, win rate. Finance may care about margin and cost. RevOps may care about process quality. And then enablement may care about adoption and behavioral change. If those expectations are not aligned up front, the evaluation becomes difficult to defend later. That's something that has to be said. The second challenge is often weak manager reinforcement. So a lot of enablement programs do not fail when it comes to delivery per se, but they fail because the desired behavior is not inspected in the field and observed, right? So that then managers can actually coach and give feedback and let the rep adjust the behavior. So it's very easy to come back essentially to square one, to the usual habits, right? So the third challenge is poor or incomplete data. And this is something you have to navigate depending on the maturity of your organization, right? Of course, if the CRM fields are inconsistent, the code review may only cover like a very small sample. There is not enough volume overall. Content analytics may show that someone opened an asset, but not whether it improved the quality of the customer conversation, for example. There are definitely some limits that you have to be aware of in the metrics, but depending on your maturity level, the most important thing is that you actually communicate upfront what these limits are. That's how you build the credibility. Ultimately, over time, you want to get to answer the question of what evidence can we trust enough to inspect and use in our evaluation. Then the fourth challenge is weak baseline logic. I think when we talk about baseline, a simple before and after comparison can be often misleading, especially when it's done in very short interval before and after. If win rate improved after the program, was that because of enablement, or did the territory coverage change? Did pricing change? Did marketing improve lead quality? Did market condition improve? We just don't know, right? So it's very important that there is some clear logic when it comes to baseline. And in the guide that I actually developed, that you can review by looking it down in the comments, I really speak more clearly about how do you think about baseline and how do you try and understand the likely trajectory and the context around the change so that you can normalize the information and the trends in a way that then you can actually isolate the impact that might have been due to the activities that Enablement has done together with the other cross-functional group. So the fifth challenge is attribution. And we all know that enablement rarely influences outcomes alone. That doesn't mean enablement had no impact. It simply means that ultimately we're working with other teams. So we need to treat contribution carefully. A credible story might say enablement delivered the program, manager reinforced the inspection rhythm, business quality improved, discounting reduced in the target segment, and finance agreed to attribute a conservative share of the improvement to the program itself. So that's much stronger than saying enablement caused the revenue increase. Because if we talk in terms of causation, ultimately, despite we might be trying to prove the impact at all costs, we might actually lose credibility in that process. So I would say in many cases, a simpler contribution narrative with clear execution evidence is more credible, more useful, and more sustainable. And again, in the guide, I also provide some clear example of what the impact narrative can look like. Now, another aspect I'd like to touch on is about how do we adapt the level at which we measure enablement ROI depending on different aspects of our organization. For example, let's say you're in a small company or a low maturity enablement team. I will keep things very light, right? Similar to what we said. Use one program, one outcome, two execution indicators, and one shared review. You focus on building the habit of defining outcomes and inspection behavior. Do not start trying to calculate function level ROI, we said. For example, if the team has no formal enablement scorecard, do not wait until one exists. Pick one active program, create a basic ROI contract, as we said, and that can already raise the quality of the conversation. Now, if you are in a large, more mature organization, the model can become more standardized. You might use a common ROI contract template that you define, a consistent impact narrative format, use strong shared baseline principles, and then maybe obviously each region, segment, or motion should still choose the execution signal that makes sense for that specific context, like how they see the field and what kind of things are measured in the field. I would say a mid-market value selling program, for example, should not use the exact same evidence chain as an enterprise account planning program or a new hire onboarding redesign, of course. So the structure can be consistent. The signals should be shifting depending on the context, the region, etc. Now, if RevOps support is limited or sales ops support is limited, you can use manual inspection, right? I know that many teams operate without support in that sense when it comes to data. As a result of that, I don't think that should stop anyone from actually going ahead with creating an impact narrative and using the data they have available. You can still inspect a small number of live opportunities, calls, business cases, have manager do actually reviews, and then you might still have certification with specific outputs that are tied to the desired behavior and the desired, I would say, skill set. Still, a small but reliable evidence set is better than a large report that ultimately nobody is gonna review. If RevOps and finance support is strong, it's important that you bring them in before launch. Ask them to help define the baseline, the attribution assumption, the cost categories, and timing for any ROI calculation. That way, it's much easier to compared to involving them after the program has finished and then trying to basically convince them that's how it has been created. So if in general as well, if leadership involvement is limited, I would be careful with how you frame the work. You don't necessarily call it an ROI framework. That can make it feel like bigger, heavier, or more, I would say, finance-led than it needs to be. Instead, ask a simpler question, like what should good execution look like and how will managers inspect it? Simple as that. That is a great entry point. And if the workflow is complex, try and narrow the scope. Like you want to choose one motion, one segment, one sales stage, and one behavior to improve, because that way it makes it easier actually to portray the impact. For example, do not try to improve sales execution across the whole organization. Start with business case quality before proposal in mid-market opportunity as well. That makes the discussion much easier. Now, as we get towards the end of this video, I think I want to leave you with a more of a practical step again. So if we were to take an action like this week, I would choose one active or upcoming enablement program and create a one-page ROE contract. So you want to keep it simple. You write down the business problem, write down the outcome the program should support, choose 2 behavioral execution outputs that should change, like this is in the field. List the enablement outputs. You will deliver things that you control. Define what manager need to reinforce and inspect. Choose the evidence source. Set the first review date. And then in case, if it's appropriate, you can also define the cost categories you will track. Then you want to review that one page with one sales leader, one person from RevOps or finance, whoever are the partners that you need to liaise with. And ultimately, like, you don't want to prove ROI this week. The goal is to stop the program from being measured later against unclear expectation. That's the biggest mistake you can make. Like, clear expectation from the beginning will make everything easier after, and it will allow you as well to communicate in an adaptable way and always tell where you stand based on the things that have been defined initially. So to close, I think the core idea here is that you don't start with the ROI formula. You start with the business problem. You define the execution change you expect to see in the field. You agree what evidence will be important, and only you calculate ROI when the signal coming, like the different signal leading and lagging indicator that are coming from the activity of the business, are mature enough to support it. So the full guide and one-pager are linked in the description below. If you want a deeper model, example, templates, and visual reference for sales enablement ROI. Catch you soon.